Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Mark Greenberg. I direct the Human Services Initiative at the Migration Policy Institute. MPI's work addresses a broad range of immigration issues in the United States and around the world, and the Human Services Initiative focuses on immigration issues affecting families and children and humanitarian populations and the intersections of immigration with health and human services programs and policies. Today's webinar concerns how the child welfare system can better respond to needs of children from immigrant families. And I need to begin with a few housekeeping notes. First, if you have any technical problems during the webinar, please email to events@migrationpolicy.org, or you can call 202-266-1929. Second, we will have time for Q&A after the initial presentations. It won't be voice Q&A, so please type any questions into the Q&A box, or you can email them to events@migrationpolicy.org. You can submit your questions at any time while the speakers are presenting, or once the Q&A session begins. For today's webinar, we're very pleased to have participants from the American Public Human Services Association and 3 jurisdictions: South Carolina, New York City, and New Mexico. The states and New York City will be talking about their recent experiences and insights about improving services in the child welfare system for children with immigrant family members. In a few minutes, we'll turn to our state and city presenters, but before doing so, I want to provide a few brief comments. Children of immigrants, like other children, can enter the child welfare system when there's been a substantiated allegation of parental abuse or neglect. Many issues relating to how the child welfare system operates are equally applicable to children of immigrants and other children. But there are also a set of very distinct issues and needs for children of immigrants, including but not limited to issues around the legal status of children, parents or other family members, language access, cultural competency, distinctive issues when parents or other family members are residing in other countries, or when parents or other family members are at risk of immigration enforcement or removal. And issues also are arising in the context of unaccompanied children released to parents or other adults in communities. MPI and APHSA have been working together on a range of immigration child welfare issues since 2018. Initially, we engaged in a project that involved meeting with and interviewing state and local child welfare administrators, which led to a report we issued in 2019 called Immigrant Families and Child Welfare Systems, Emerging Needs and Promising Policies. We've continued working together since then, including in relation to a set of federal state coordination issues that have come to public attention about licensing of shelters and other facilities for unaccompanied children. And this year, we organized a roundtable of state and local administrators and did a set of interviews to explore recent and emerging issues for child welfare agencies. We've drawn from this work and our discussions to develop an infographic, which is now available at both of our websites, entitled Best Practices for Child Welfare and Working with Families with Immigrant Members. And you'll be able to see a link to it later. In our discussions with state and local administrators, we found that issues can be very different for jurisdictions with larger and smaller numbers of families with immigrant members, and quite different for jurisdictions near or far from the border. But there are a set of common questions and issues that all jurisdictions face. Among them, how to develop internal capacity within the child welfare agency to address the most common questions that emerge in cases and to have resources to turn to for the less common ones. How to ensure that a core set of issues are addressed in training for all staff with direct contact with families, so that even if caseworkers aren't specializing in immigration-related issues, they can identify when a case might present issues that require connecting with a specialist. And then how to have more intensive training for staff who will be working with families with immigrant members. How to develop effective screening mechanisms and legal service referrals, most obviously for special immigrant juvenile status, but also going beyond SIJ to a range of other immigration status issues. How to ensure the agency can effectively address situations when a parent or relative is in or expects to be in another country, how to address confidentiality, how to develop needed relationships with ICE for situations when parents are in immigration detention or facing removal. In our work, we found enormous variation between jurisdictions. Some jurisdictions have specialized staff, others don't. Some have significant staff training, many others do not. Some have comprehensive screening for immigration status, others don't. Some have developed arrangements for addressing cases when parents or caretakers are in immigration detention. And again, significant variation across jurisdictions. And even in the jurisdictions that have done the most to develop policies and practices, they are continuing to refine their practices over time. So in today's webinar, we'll highlight the experience of 2 states with different contexts and experiences, along with the experience of New York City. We hope that states and counties and other stakeholders will find the infographic and the related resources as helpful to them as they ask where they might strengthen policy and practice. And we encourage listeners in the call who are aware of promising practices in their state or locality to reach out to us and share that with us. And now I would like to turn to Ann Flagg, the Senior Director of Policy and Practice at APHSA, who will offer some additional overview comments and then introduce our speakers. Ann?
Thanks so much, Mark. We sincerely appreciate this opportunity to continue to partner with MPI to advance policy solutions and equitable practices and services for immigrant families, particularly those involved in both the child welfare and immigration systems. So before I jump in, for those who aren't familiar, the American Public Human Services Association, or APHSA, is the bipartisan national membership association representing state and local health and human services agencies and supporting them to execute their mission to improve outcomes for people nationwide. Building on our longstanding relationships with health and human services leaders, we focus on generating pragmatic solutions that advance the well-being of individuals, families, and communities. Through our affinity group, the National Association of Public Child Welfare Administrators, we've worked to improve programs and service delivery for all families engaged in the child welfare and human services systems, but specifically immigrant families, by increasing visibility of this issue in communities, elevating state and local innovative practices that advance equity, and support child and family well-being, and developing and aggregating best practice guides and tools for child welfare organizations. No matter where a child or family lives or where they come from, system leaders are responding to the imperative to build tools in their practice and policy toolbox to provide prevention services, prevent out-of-home placements, use culturally informed practice models that meet the needs of children and their families, and build care and family support options for children that ensure cultural connections and permanency for kids who come to the attention of the child welfare system. What we know is this: more than a fourth of all children in the US are children of immigrants, and nearly a third of children experiencing poverty are children of immigrants. We recognize that the risk for children living in poverty families experiencing poverty to come to the attention of the child welfare system is heightened based on just poverty as a single risk factor. So recognizing all of these risk factors that poverty can create for family involvement in child welfare system, it's critical that state and local agencies continuously review and practice strategies to ensure quality services to families with an immigration experience. More specifically, we know that 6 million kids in this country have at least one unauthorized parent, and data from 2019 indicated removal of 28,000 immigrants who claimed a US citizen child. The alignment across human services, judiciary, and child welfare and immigration enforcement systems are critical to supporting the best possible outcomes for families duly involved in these systems. MPI and APHSA have worked to identify the key levers within child welfare system that Mark so beautifully laid out. And you know, the range, organizational structure, practice and process questions, staff training, developing relationships with key external partners like consulates, attorney and legal resources, consulates, to name a few. So we are really, really excited to bring to you, both a sort of culmination of the findings as well as some sort of new best practices we've discovered, over the course of the last few months. So we have, the speakers really represent a lot of different points along the journey of building capacity to better serve families engaged in these systems. As I said, we've had the honor to learn from a few, like New York City, who've really been developing this practice model for quite some time, as well as some sort of more evolving practices like we'll hear from South Carolina. So each of these systems are really distinctive in their demographics, population size, organizational structure, and we hope that each of them will offer something for each of you to take away and apply in your own systems and communities. So with that, I'll introduce our speakers. First up, we're going to hear from the state of South Carolina. So we have Lisa Armstrong. Lisa serves as the statewide education and non-citizen advocate for the Child Health and Wellbeing team of the South Carolina Department of Social Services. She is a former trial and appellate attorney who represented indigent and private clients, as well as serving as the guardian ad litem in family court. In September 2018, Lisa began serving as the director of the Foster Care Review Board of South Carolina, where she stayed until joining the Wellbeing team. And she'll be joined by Dennis Gmerick. Dennis is the Assistant General Counsel for the South Carolina Department of Social Services and has worked with the department for 10 years. Next, we'll hear from New York City. Eliane Martiz serves as the Director of Immigrant Services and Language Affairs for the New York City Administration of Children's Services, which works to ensure that all ACS programming is inclusive and accessible to immigrant and limited English proficient New Yorkers. She has served in this role for over 3 years. Then we're going to pop across the country to our colleagues in New Mexico. We were intending to have 2 speakers today. I'm going to introduce them both. But we did have a little bit of an emergency, and so we're down to 1 speaker. But for the purposes of having all of the resources that built this work known to the audience today, we'll go ahead and introduce them both. So joining us today is Andres Santiago. He is the immigration attorney with the New Mexico Department of Children, Youth, and Families, working to support immigrant and refugee children across the state. Megan Fino Velasquez is the director of the New Mexico Department of Children, Youth, and Families. And Megan's also an associate professor and director of the Center on Immigration and Child Welfare in the School of Social Work at New Mexico State University. Megan unfortunately did have to leave the meeting for today. So if there are any particular questions, she did welcome us collecting them for Team New Mexico and sharing back any follow-up as is helpful. So with that, I think I can turn it on over to Team South Carolina.
Hey guys, I am Dennis Kimbrough, and I'm the managing attorney for county operations for DSS here in South Carolina. Welcome to everybody today. It's my pleasure to talk with you about South Carolina's experience when it comes to this population of children. As you can imagine, we are one of those small jurisdictions that Anne and Mark referred to when it came to immigration issues and how we've dealt with it. I have been in the Office of General Counsel now since 2011. Prior to that point in time, I was a prosecuting attorney for the department. I have been with the agency now for 23 years. One of the issues that was assigned to me when I first got to the Office of General Counsel was, how do we deal with children who are entering foster care who has immigration issues? South Carolina we had just gone through a couple of cases that had some really not good outcomes for the children that we were dealing with because of their immigration status. We were having TPR, termination parental rights actions, and their related adoptions action got to go sidewise because we weren't really paying attention to immigration issues. So one of the things I was tasked with when I first got here was coming up with a policy as it pertains to these immigration children and what our procedure should be. Now, for South Carolina, that really meant about a population of between 10 to 15 kids in the entire foster care system at that point in time. We really did not have a large population to deal with. So I felt pretty comfortable in, okay, this is just another part of my job. I partnered with an attorney with the Appleseeds, which is our legal service organization here in South Carolina. I also partner with an outstanding individual with the South Carolina Immigrant Victim Network, or SC-VAN. Tricia Raven, who some of y'all may have dealt with her. She is like the expert in South Carolina as it came to immigration issues. And we developed a fairly straightforward flow chart of how we were going to deal with children that came into the foster care system that had immigration issues. We modified our SACWIS system as far as being able to identify the system. A report was able to be run once a month in order to identify. And we came up with a policy that basically said that, okay, I'm going to start tracking these kids. I'm just going to add it to my job. There's not that many kids. We developed a statewide training program that went well. And every 3 months, I pull my list of kids, go through it, and say, okay, I needed to talk with the county staff as far as what's happening with the child or what's not happening with the child. And like I said, we had a small population, and these kids that we were dealing with were what we would traditionally call, the straightforward abuse and neglect kids. They were children that had suffered some sort of physical abuse, sexual abuse. So it kind of was just kind of like a normal course of action with these immigration issues thrown in. But we felt pretty comfortable that we had a way to do it. Fast forward 5 years ago, and our population and our minds exploded. We began to have, instead of the 14 to 15 to 16 kids that I was used to working with, we were now having 50 kids plus enter the foster care system that had immigration issues. And for those of you who work for human welfare service agencies, jobs descriptions, they kind of expanded. So I had more jobs duties that were assigned to me than, and no job duties taken away from me. So with immigration, we began to have a conversation in-house and with our external partners that we really needed to have a dedicated person to really deal with this issue. Enter stage left 6 months ago, Lisa Armstrong, who is our advocate. Lisa, I'm going to turn it over to you at this point.
Thank you, Dennis, and thank you for the invitation. I'm so glad to be here today. And as Dennis said, I've been here since May, or I've been here 6 months. And when I came in, Dennis handed me his materials and offered to be a source of discussion about what was out there. But otherwise, my job was to essentially help to create greater capacity internally and to essentially help case managers when they got a non-citizen case. South Carolina still does not have nearly the number of other states. So even though our case managers are trained specifically on immigration matters, they try to identify our non-citizen children and youth. They're certainly not specialists, nor do they have, frankly, the ability to be, because their chances of getting a non-citizen case are about 1 out of 100. So it's a fairly rare thing for one of the case managers to get a non-citizen client. So in addressing some of the issues that were mentioned earlier, the policies and practices essentially became my first task. We needed to work on making sure that our policies were up to date and to develop some practices that would work to further providing for non-citizen children and youth. And one of the biggest problems in the past was that there wasn't someone who had the time to devote to this population. So I have a dual role with education and non-citizen issues, and it's really a great combination because our non-citizens end up having unique educational needs as well. So I'm dealing with both of those issues. But one of the things we have done is, in my role, I offer hands-on assistance to case managers. We ask case managers, upon identifying a non-citizen case, to staff that case with the full team early on. We need to make sure the consulate gets their notice within that 5 days. We need to make sure that we can identify a location. If there's a parent out of the country, we need to make sure that we know how to get in touch with them. You know, our job is not to keep children necessarily in the country indefinitely. We need to make sure that our case management is reflective of the facts and what is in the best interest of that child. So if there's a parent out of the country, we need to make sure we're in touch with that parent. We need to make sure that we're doing our jobs as child welfare professionals, not just simply looking at the immigration aspect. We need to look at it as a whole. So part of what I do is make sure that those connections are kept current, that we have that types of information, and to make sure that the case managers have it so that they can do the connecting between the parents and the child. As part of that, Dennis was looking at cases every 3 months, but because of my role being more specific to immigration, I'm looking monthly at each of these cases. We have a spreadsheet, which initially I created that was very skeletal. It now contains a section for things like child health and well-being. Essentially, you know, are we seeing anything about the child's functioning or their progress that suggests that we need to do more for that child? Not just following their legal situation and their immigration concerns, but also their overall health and well-being. So in these monthly staffings, we have case managers. Oftentimes I will talk to the clinical teams that deal with psychological issues and psychiatric, as well as other health needs. And all of this is done on a master index, which is available. Actually, it's now being provided to our clinical team so they can take a look at this special population and just keep it fresh in their minds that this is a group that if they're hearing about these particular children, they may want to, you know, be especially attentive. They may have some special needs, so that when they're doing their staffings clinically, they bear that in mind. The other thing that we try to keep up with are things like benefits. If a child is eligible for an SIJS, we want to make sure that we identify that early, that we get them what they're entitled to. We get those applications filed. One of the things we don't want to do is miss an opportunity if a child is eligible for a status adjustment. And as Dennis said, if you don't have a well-crafted system, that can happen. I am pleased to announce that recently one of the first cases we had was a child who came into care 17 and a half years old, pregnant. The idea was to reunify. Somehow, for a variety of reasons, that went south. But because we had great outside support from the immigration attorneys who were very supportive of what we're trying to do for our non-citizen population, we had a wonderful immigration attorney that was able to get this child in the SIJS pipeline and beat that deadline. So that was huge. So as far as the policies and practices and what difference it makes, I really think the early identification is huge. You know, these are time-sensitive cases, and we don't want anybody to miss out on the opportunity to have an adjustment of status if we can give that to them. The other point that I would make as far as the difference is that multidisciplinary team approach. We want to make sure we're not just making sure that they're being communicated with the correct language, but also that we're meeting their overall health and well-being. And I believe my time is up. So thank you very much for letting me speak.
So my name is Julian Muritz, and I'm the Director of Immigrant Services and Language Affairs for New York City. I think you can all see now. So the New York City Administration for Children's Services is the child welfare agency for the 5 boroughs of New York City. We cover a lot of different areas, including child protection investigations. We offer prevention services. We have our family permanency services, which contracts with nonprofit agencies for foster care services. And we also do juvenile justice and early childhood. So it was really interesting to hear from South Carolina and kind of development of the Immigrant Service Office there. And I think it followed a similar trajectory here at ACS before I came on. But now our office is a standalone office that's entirely dedicated to immigrant services and language affairs. So we're within the Division of External Affairs, and we cover two subject areas: language access programs and immigration programs. So here's just a small sample of the type of work that we can do. We help write agency policies on these topics. We give tons and tons of trainings. We provide case consultations, quality assurance. We do UNT visa certifications and community engagement and partnerships. We also have our Immigration Services for Youth and Care program, which I'll be telling you about today. As Mark said, different jurisdictions have different immigrant populations. New York City is absolutely the city of immigrants. We're very proud of our immigrant population. Generally speaking, about 36% of New York City total population are immigrants. And the statistic is always very interesting to me. At least about 60% of New York City children live in a household with at least one immigrant family member. So this is the majority of New York City children. Immigration is going to come into their lives. And 22% of all New Yorkers are limited English proficient, so they need interpretation or translation services. So I'm going to talk about two main parts of our immigration support for the families we work with. We have a dedicated program called Immigration Services for Youth and Care, which I'll talk a little bit about. And we also provide immigration support and case consultations for ACS involved families. So the Immigration Services for Youth and Care program, ISYC, was started in response to a local law that was passed about the need to ensure that we were meeting the immigration needs of all youth who are coming into foster care. And then that was mirrored with a policy that the agency wrote. So the policy states that all youth who come into ACS foster care who are not US citizens need to be identified and referred for immigration legal services. Why? Well, we say that this is it's not only good practice, but it is integral to permanency planning for any youth. So if we're looking at ensuring that youth can have access to services, resources, and opportunities that enable them to live independent, productive lives after leaving foster care, they need to be able to get the best immigration status possible. There's various areas this touches, but in particular, when applying for housing after leaving foster care, many youth want to go into public housing such as NYCHA housing. They need to have lawful status, education if they want federal financial aid, work authorization, many types of health insurance. So if we are being responsible about ensuring that the youth leaving care are getting the best services and supports that they need, we need to make sure that they are on their path to getting legal status. So this is a huge undertaking. We work with a lot of different partners here. So we have the ACS Immigration Services for Youth and Care program at the center. We work with other ACS divisions. We work with the 27 or so foster care agencies that we contract with, and then the immigration legal service providers. So these are nonprofits that are largely city funded, or federally funded for immigration legal support, or have other sources of funding, and they provide free pro bono immigration legal help for our youth. So the Immigration Services for Youth and Care program oversees foster care agencies' efforts to assist the immigrant youth and children who come into care. We also provide training to all the foster care immigration liaisons, which I'll tell you more about in a second. We also assist on individual cases. There are some cases that present complex needs, and we always help with those. And then we also, as South Carolina was saying, track and monitor the progress of all these cases to make sure that they're moving along and the youth are getting the support that they need. So a really key part of this process is what our immigration liaisons. So every one of the foster care agencies that we work with is required to have a dedicated immigration liaison. And the immigration liaison is a point person for our program and all the other collaborative partners. And they are the in-house resource and coordinator on immigration issues. They are the ones that are doing the reports to ensure that the cases are moving along, that we review. And they also can answer questions about other immigration needs. We work with the immigration legal service providers, as I mentioned. So these are all nonprofits in New York City who provide immigration legal help more generally, but as part of their help, they also provide free immigration legal help for our youth in foster care. And they get specialized training about working with youth in foster care, because that can be different than the the experience of working with other populations. They are the only ones who file the immigration applications and documentation. They are the ones who are checking on the case with the government. They are the ones providing immigration advice. We always say only ask for immigration advice from the legal service provider, and they can represent the youth in front of the immigration court or the federal government more generally. So the goal here is that we want every youth who comes into care, and every immigrant youth should leave with the strongest immigration status that they're eligible. So I'll make a note that this is not just special immigrant juvenile status. Our goal is to help them get their green card, or if they already have a green card, we want to make sure that they, if they're eligible for citizenship, that we help them apply for citizenship. And if they are eligible for citizenship, ACS will pay for the immigration related fees. And we also will help pay for the fees of the medical exam or anything related to their immigration process. Here in New York City, youth can stay in care until 21, but they may also be allowed to stay in care past 21 if they are waiting for their green card to become current and they can't apply for housing otherwise. So if that is the barrier to getting housing, they can stay in care until they can get their green card. We also provide other forms of immigration support for ACS involved families more generally. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those. ACS issues U visa certifications, technically U non-immigrant status certifications. So since we are a child protective services agency and we conduct investigations, we can certify we can provide a U certification for victims of certain crimes who have cooperated with the investigation. This is really a very important tool in building trust with our undocumented community. Many undocumented immigrants are fearful of working with local government, and by allowing them to apply for the U visa application, they are given a benefit as well for cooperating with our investigation. And it's also helpful for families to get on the path to lawful status. It makes them eligible for benefits that could support family stability. We also provide an array of other services. Case support is a huge one. We field questions every single day from all different parts of the agency and caseworkers and leadership about how to help support cases where there are complicated immigration needs. We also can, explain changes in immigration law. I put public charge here as an example. This was a huge question for a lot of our frontline staff because we were finding that many immigrant families were scared to get referrals for services that was necessary for their child welfare case, and so trying to understand why we saw that change, and so explaining what the public charge actually meant and how to refer families to immigration help if they had questions about it. We also provide many trainings about working with immigrant families, both about understanding immigration law, but also about cultural sensitivity and responsiveness, understanding how to be work in a trauma-informed way when working with immigrant families. We also do a lot of community engagement and working groups with different advocates and nonprofits in New York City. We coordinate with the New York City Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs, who is an incredible partner in supporting immigrant families in New York City. They are a huge resource and wealth of information, and they work with all city agencies. And then in addition to that, as I mentioned, we also do the language access contract management and policy. So we have contracts with different interpretation and translation vendors. We have policies about ensuring that all limited English proficient clients receive adequate interpretation and translation services. And that's a major part of what we do. Okay, I think I'm up with my time. So do you want to share?
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining today. My name is Santiago. I am an immigration attorney here at New Mexico Children, Youth, and Families Department. I was to be joined today by the Director of Immigration Affairs, Megan Velasquez, but unfortunately, she had an emergency and is unable to join us today. Next slide, please. Thank you. So who are we? We are a mighty team of 4. Our director is Megan Velasquez. She came on to the, she really formed the immigration unit in 2019. Prior to 2019, from about 2009 through about 2016, there was a liaison for the Children, Youth, and Families Department here in New Mexico. Unfortunately, after 2016, there were a couple years where that position went unfilled. So with the addition of the Director of Immigration Affairs in 2019, the Child Welfare Agency very much tried to focus on this population of non-citizens being a border state. In 2019, by the end of that year, an immigration specialist was hired for protective services. This individual is just, I can't even tell you enough about her, but she has lots of experience in child welfare and at the intersection with immigration. She is mainly responsible for transnational services, our consular notifications on the protective services side. And also she helps to facilitate communication with parents in home countries if there is a parent in a home country. In 2020, I was brought on an immigration attorney. In my role, I have a couple different things that I do. I do work with frontline staff on cases where there is a non-citizen child, youth, or family member. For the children or youth, we are able to directly screen for those, and I'll get into that a little bit later. For the families, whether it's a parent, whether it may just be a family member who has some immigration complications, our unit is able to connect those family members with nonprofits, mostly within the state of New Mexico, to assist with any immigration complications. In 2021, we were able to add a position for an immigration specialist for our juvenile justice services. Here in New Mexico, the Child Welfare Agency does not prosecute these cases. That's our district attorney's office. Public defender is the one who will defend the juvenile for any adjudication. But the Child Welfare Agency is involved if the juvenile is committed to a facility, or if that juvenile is later put on probation. And so the immigration specialist, similar to on the juvenile justice side, similar to the immigration specialist on the protective services side, will notify the consulate of that non-citizen youth. We also notify if there's a U.S. citizen youth, but one of the parents may be from a foreign country. We will provide direct screenings for juveniles if they so choose. We also connect public defenders with immigration practitioners who are able to analyze any juvenile charges or juvenile pleas. Next slide, please. So who do we serve here in New Mexico? Well, as probably is no surprise to anyone, we serve immigrant and mixed status families here in New Mexico who are involved with state child welfare and or the juvenile justice systems. Now, interesting to me, when I first entered this role, I thought that there was going to be a lot of family separation involved, and that's really not the case in New Mexico. A lot of these cases that we see are the result of abuse or neglect allegations. There may be deportation orders present within the immigration history of the family, and this can sometimes complicate relief options for family members as we're making those referrals to some of the nonprofits. Many families have one parent who is in a home country and another parent who is in the United States. Our unit will help facilitate some of that communication with parents who are outside of the United States. More recently, we have seen, unfortunately, an uptick in children who are both victims of labor trafficking and commercial sex trafficking. For those that may not know, New Mexico, we are a border state. We do Texas. We do border Texas on the one side and we border Arizona on the other. We have seen an uptick with labor trafficking in regards to children who are given documentation showing they're over the age of 18 and they're forced to work on dairy farms in rural areas, rural parts of the state. In regards to the commercial sex trafficking that we've seen, a lot of times this is not commercial sex trafficking for a monetary value or anything like that. It's typically for protection, it's for housing, it's for food, it's to pay off a debt. It's a little bit different in regards to that here in New Mexico, we do report any suspicion of commercial sex trafficking or labor trafficking within 24 hours to the Office of Trafficking in Persons, which is federally under Health and Human Services. Next slide, please. So this is just an overview slide of what we do. As I mentioned, we consult on cases involving immigrant families. Similar to the other presenters on the call, we really try to identify these cases as early as possible so that they can be screened. And if a child or a youth or a family member may be eligible for an immigration benefit for the family member, we're going to refer them to nonprofits. For that child or youth, we want to see if we're going to move forward and be able to directly represent. We typically do not directly represent, but we do assist with getting those predicate orders for special immigrant juvenile status. We are exploring at this point a U certification, T certification. We also, as I stated, we do consular notifications. We are the liaison for foreign country consulates, which we work with very closely. We even have a memorandum of understanding with the Mexican consulate. We assist with communicating to relatives in foreign countries, as I've already said. We do provide translation services, which means we have a contract with a third party to translate documents, not just into Spanish, but into other languages as well. We can represent on a case-by-case basis for children. We do consult and we do report federally human trafficking, suspicion of human trafficking. And we also collaborate with community-based immigrant serving organizations. Next slide, please. We also have worked very closely at large with the Child Welfare Agency to license non-citizen relatives to become resource parents and provide them with training and support. We had to update policy around special immigrant juvenile status to align the language with current federal standard and law. We've updated our policies around suspected trafficking so that our unit is reporting any suspicion of trafficking. We've also updated our processes in regards to consular notifications so that we're ensuring those consular notifications are typically going out in about 24 hours for when the child is coming into the custody of the Child Welfare Agency. We had to update our communication with Department of Homeland Security. A number of our counties do border Mexico. And we had to ensure that we had sort of one point of contact for Department of Homeland Security, which can include all kinds of, whether it's Border Patrol, whether it's ICE, whether it's Health and Human Services on the other end, we had to have one point of contact for that. And then lastly, language access plan was also rolled out. Next slide, please. And some of the complications that we've seen, as many may already be aware, in regards to special immigrant juvenile status, the population that we serve here in New Mexico, many of the children and youth are from Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. And unfortunately for these countries in particular, there is a longer wait time to move forward with residency because there's a backlog on the number of visas. And so similar to our colleagues from New York and from South Carolina, we have had to monitor these on a monthly basis as well to see when we can move forward or when we can recommend to move forward for residency. A number of our children and youth are in deportation proceedings, which can complicate immigration relief. We do work very closely with Department of Homeland Security, with ICE trial attorneys to try to negotiate out our children from some of their cases if they are in deportation proceedings. Many of these children have been identified as victims of trafficking or are eligible for special immigrant juvenile status. And we try to negotiate with ICE in regards to those cases. If ICE is unwilling to move forward, then we do refer out to a nonprofit. And lastly, reentry after deportation. And this is more for the parents. Sometimes parents who have orders of deportation, they come back into the United States and then they're criminally prosecuted for illegal reentry to the United States with an order of deportation, which can lead to months, if not years, incarcerated. And I believe my time is up, so I'm going to go ahead and stop there.
Thank you very, very much to our panelists. You have provided a lot for people to think about and learn from in your presentations. We've got a number of questions. In the remaining time, we'll go through as many questions as we can. If you're not yet in the queue for your questions, you can use the Q&A function to write questions. You can also use chat, but if everybody would try to use Q&A, that helps us keep them all in one place. You can also email events@migrationpolicy.org with your questions, or you could tweet your questions to @migrationpolicy, #MPI discuss. We've had some questions just about whether the PowerPoints will be available, and the PowerPoints and audio will be available at the MPI website tomorrow. And with that, let's start going into some questions. Several people asked questions about language access. And among the questions, one person asked about what measures or standards do you use in relation to interpretation and translation. There was a question about monolingual Spanish speakers. There was also a question about speakers of languages other than English and Spanish. So let me open this up to the panelists, and any of you or all of you are welcome to comment on this one if you'd like.
I'm happy to answer, if that's helpful. So as I mentioned during my presentation, our office also covers immigration or our language access services. So this is a major part of what we do day in and day out. So I can only speak for our agency, but we have a language access policy which describes best practices around language access, and we're operating under a federal, state, and local law, all of which require us to provide equal access to limited English proficient families. And we do this through a variety of ways. Bilingual staff at the agency can get certified so that they can work directly in other languages, or we have several different vendors that we work with to provide either in-person, video remote, or on-demand telephonic interpretation. And those are available in hundreds of languages. So that's how we provide language access services. I don't know if that answers the question.
Thank you. Thank you. Anybody else want to comment on that one?
I'll just quickly add that we also, as Eliana said from New York, we do those things as well. In addition to that, we also have a third-party contract for translation of documents to ensure that documents are readily available in languages other than English. We have used this from everything from the Navajo language to languages other than Spanish.
I was going to say, we also in South Carolina, we have a list of vendors, but one of the things that's happened is we try to make sure that we understand where exactly the child is from, which part of the country, because what we've found is that, unfortunately, especially when you're dealing with such a small number, there's just kind of an assumption that, or there has been an assumption. It's not so much anymore. We're trying to sort of stamp that out, but that if they don't speak English and they're from a country that is believed to be Spanish speaking, that they must speak Spanish, and that is oftentimes not true. So we try to be mindful of that and really drill down as much as we can to figure out where they are, and then we have people in the community that will help us figure out what the language likely is, and then go from there. Oftentimes we can get it that way.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. We then got a couple of questions which are sort of about what more can you say to describe the children? And in particular, one person asked, what about ages? One person asked, how many of the cases involve recently arrived children versus non-citizen children who've been in the country for some time versus US citizen children of non-citizen parents or legal guardians? And this is an area where there is not federal data to help us understand the answers to this question. So I welcome if any of the panelists feel you can better describe the children based upon what you've seen.
I will say that recently there have been a number of cases that have come across my desk that seem to involve children who are being who have been victimized as victims of labor trafficking. And I feel like this is one of those, you know, they're 10 to 14 to 15, they're not in school, they're living in areas, you know, where they're sort of kept out of, you know, a lot of people's sight. And so though that age range seems to have been, it seems to be occurring more often. And I think that, you know, one of the things we've talked about is needing to be especially careful to try to identify those. I mean, we have screening for human trafficking, but I feel like it's one of those areas that may be growing in South Carolina that we need to be, you know, sort of more aware of it.
Yeah, and I would probably add, it's not necessarily growing in South Carolina, we're just becoming more aware of it. You know, in addition to our immigration policy, we recently revamped our trafficking policy, and you know, as is often the case, sometimes, you know, when you really start looking and digging, you discover that there's a big chunk of issues you may have missed, because we do have a fairly strong migrant population because we're a fairly agricultural state. And so it's not unusual, you know, come March and April, when it's time to pick peaches, that, you know, there's a huge migrant population.
Yeah,
I think,
I'm
you
sorry, go
know,
ahead.
oh, sorry. I think, you know, in New York City, because just of the general immigrant population that we work with, we see all sorts of variety in the immigrant youth who come into foster care. So, you know, we'll have some cases where, you know, at first the child, you know, themselves might think that they were born here, and only after looking into it a little bit more, we realize that the child is actually, you know, was born abroad and is undocumented, and the child didn't know. Then we'll have, we definitely have cases of recently arrived children, or, you know, young adults as well. We have some youth who came through, you know, Office of Refugee Resettlement as unaccompanied minors. We have all, you know, some who've come to study here, you know, all sorts of different cases, and from all sorts of different parts of the world. So I don't know. The question was like, to more recently arrived or youth who've been here for a while. I think it's a real mix, at least in New York City.
Next,
I'm
sorry, go ahead, Andres.
Thank you. I just wanted to add that similarly here, it's a mix of ages. I will echo what South Carolina has said, though, that with trafficking specifically, it seems to be a very specific age range, more towards labor trafficking than commercial sex trafficking. That being said, though, being a border state, we have run into youth who thought they were U.S. citizens and are not. So it's been a range of ages.
Thank you. We've got a question about, are there times where there are tensions between the goal and focus on permanency in child welfare and the particular circumstances in an immigration case? And any of you care to comment on that?
Yeah, so I would have to say, well, what I am saying that, you know, we as a child welfare agency, sometimes we forget what our primary job is, and that is to reunify children with parents, regardless of where that parent may be located. And I don't know if other states are experiencing this, but there is sort of that natural bias, at least here in South Carolina, that certainly it's in a child's best interest to remain here in America, as opposed to maybe being reunified with any family in another country. And, you know, some of our placements are very aggressive when it comes to explaining to the court, or trying to explain to the court as to why it's in a child's best interest to remain here with a new family, as opposed to being reunited with their biological family.
A next question is, for states that may be struggling to convince child welfare agency leaders or human service agency leaders to invest in resources and staff to focus on these issues. What arguments did you find were most convincing to get the resources that you needed to get your program started and developed? Or what would your advice be, sort of more broadly, to another state or a county that is trying to decide whether to commit resources in this direction?
This is such a good question. And so I came into the office once it was already established, but I know that it was originally started with the with the pressure from advocates and the immigrant community organizations here in New York City. And now that we have the office, we are so busy, and I can't imagine how how child welfare agencies can operate without having an office that focuses on these issues. But what we always explain is that immigration status is an integral part of permanency planning. It is an integral part of understanding what is in the best interest of the child and ensuring that they get supports and access to resources. So if you have, if you are a child welfare agency that is operating in the United States, you are going to encounter immigrant youth or youth who have immigrant parents, and you need to be prepared to support those youth. So I highly recommend that that every agency build up this capacity and expertise as much as they can. I'm curious to hear what the other states would say.
In New Mexico, I mean, I similarly came on when the unit was already coming together and formed. But what I have found in my time here is just data collection is what's really helped us. Being able to point to, hey, there's X number of non-citizen children, there's X number of files that involve a non-citizen parent, and this is the number that also have deportation proceedings. This is the number that are SIJ eligible. This is tied in with permanency. That has really opened, I would say we've gotten more buy-in from internally from within the child welfare agency. I feel immigration can be a very niche area. And if you don't know it, it can just seem complicated and just seem like, oh, that's something I maybe should worry about, but I don't have the time to worry about it. So we've had to partner with our frontline staff, show them that we're here to support them and support these families in the goal towards permanency. And that's really worked with sort of being data driven.
Well, and excuse me, obviously in South Carolina, we're still trying to build our system, but I will say that one of the things that's been very helpful as far as trying to meet the needs, the unique needs of children who are here, who are not necessarily natural English speakers, who are of limited English proficiency, is having good relationships with outside partners, such as our educators. That has been a huge plus in helping to build the system. And there was a lot of funding as a result of COVID. There's ESSER funding, and I've been involved with dealing with some of that, and not to digress, but one of the things I saw was this real enthusiasm to be able to use those funds to benefit this particular population, because it will allow for greater services to them. And so I think having outside supports, if you're trying to build internal capacity, is very helpful, just to get sort of a view of the issue from multiple sort of perspectives. Again, we're 6 months in, so we'll see what happens.
Thank you. Thank you. We've got several questions about deportation. One is asking, have any of you done work specifically addressing the impact of deportation of a parent on children? What issues have you observed? What approaches have you taken to address those issues? We have another question asking, what happens when a parent is deported? What does it mean for the child? Might it result in the termination of parental rights? What role do you all play?
Yeah, so that is probably the worst case scenario for someone who's in the child welfare system when you have a parent who is deported. It is heart-wrenching because a lot of those do end up in TPR, because once they get deported, at least here in South Carolina, we seem to have a almost impossible time of trying to locate them in their home country. And we're still not really doing a good job of engaging those parents while they're still here and kind of stressing the importance of their responsibility to keep the agency notified as far as where they are and how do we get in contact with them. So deportation certainly is a very, very negative factor when it comes to a child in foster care in South Carolina as far as TPRs.
I might just echo what Andres said during his presentation, that we actually don't really see a lot of cases in New York City of youth coming into care specifically because of deportation. So it might be that a youth comes into care through an abuse or neglect case, and then also the parent might also have a deportation case. But more typically, if the parent is deported, here in New York, we have something called standby guardianship, which can be put in place to name another a trusted adult or family member to be the guardian for the youth. So that would prevent the child from needing to come into foster care. And we really, along with the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs, promote standby guardianship as a way of planning and safety planning. We also have a law here that can kind of extend the time on a TPR if the parent's in immigration detention, so that it does not need to be done within the same time frame, similar to if the parent is incarcerated. Obviously a deportation has a huge effect on a child, but it is not a very common reason at all for coming into ACS foster care.
I just wanted to add to that and say, as I said in my presentation, we don't have a lot of children coming into child welfare agency custody based upon a deportation. However, for parents who are deported, most of the time, because a lot of our families are straddling the border, where we have one parent in the U.S., one parent in home country, that's been a more similar situation. Now with the deportation priorities changing, we do have parents who have orders of deportation that have not been executed, which means they have an order of deportation, but they're still within the United States. We have had parents in home countries who have been previously deported. It has complicated. It has added complications for them for reunifying with their children if they've tried to come in without inspection and have been federally prosecuted for illegally reentering the country. But it is in New Mexico. It is not a. We try to still work with the families as much as we can. We will try to work with them to the best of our ability.
Thank you. We'll only have time for a few more questions, but we'll get through as many as we can. We had a couple of questions about circumstances where the parent or relative may be in another country. One person asked, how do you approach permanency planning when there's a goal of reunification in another country? And someone else asked, can you just explain what the purpose of consular notification is and what the importance of it is? And what I would say in this area, because we've got a mix of child welfare people and immigration people likely listening to the call, if somebody sort of just wants to explain, so how does this work when the parent is in another country?
I can explain very generally on my end. I'm in a very limited capacity as the immigration attorney on my team. But within our child welfare agency, we will have the parent served in that third country. We typically will work with their consulate to have them served in that third country. We also have a third party nonprofit that we work with to help facilitate not just service of parents in third country, but also if there's a home study or home assessment being completed, they will assist with that as well. We have worked with DEEF, which is a child welfare agency in Mexico. We work with child welfare agencies in Honduras as well. So that is sort of an overview of how that process works here in New Mexico.
Andres, there's actually a specific question for you, which is, can you say more about how New Mexico built a program for non-citizen relatives to become licensed foster parents? This is from a state that is struggling with this issue.
I would be happy to pass that along to my director, who has more details in regards to that. I don't want to misspeak without her being present.
Okay, and then Eliane, a question for you. Just asking, I think, to clarify, ACS is an entity separate from Child Welfare Services in New York. Is New York City? Is that right?
ACS is the child welfare agency. New York State is a county-run system, so ACS is the child welfare agency for the 5 counties that comprise New York City.
And then a question potentially for all of you. Because of the increased numbers of unaccompanied children arriving this year and being placed in emergency sites, has that posed additional challenges for you in seeing children coming into child welfare or in other ways?
Well, I would say one challenge is that people often think that they are in ACS care. They don't understand the difference between federal care under the Office of Refugee Resettlement and state child welfare. So there's a lot of confusion in the public about where unaccompanied minors are. New York City has does have a very big program for unaccompanied minors through contracts with the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And many of the nonprofits that we contract with also have programs that are completely separate, but with the Office of Refugee Resettlement. We haven't seen, I don't think we've seen a direct strain or anything on our resources, but it's definitely something that we're aware of. And when we can provide support or expertise or anything like that, we'll always reach out and support them.
Just to echo that, here in New Mexico, our entire border is comprised and lumped in with El Paso, Texas. So it's considered the El Paso, Texas sector. So any unaccompanied minors that are encountered along the New Mexico border are detained by Border Patrol and then referred to Health and Human Services. They do not remain in New Mexico. New Mexico does not have a facility for unaccompanied minors currently. And so it really hasn't been a strain on resources in that regard. There have been cases where unaccompanied minors were reunified with sponsors, and there were just typical abuse and neglect claims that came up, and our investigators would have to go out and investigate. But that's sort of outside of the purview. Lastly, similar to what Eliane was saying, we have had to redirect individuals who think that unaccompanied minors are in our custody and care, and they are not. We will direct them to Health and Human Services. There are also some non-profits like Vecina in Texas that work very closely with reunifying unaccompanied minors to sponsors.
I think we've got time for one last question, and this is several of you, maybe all of you, mentioned in your comments the importance of working with children who are eligible for special immigrant juvenile status. And the question here is, how are you addressing situations where children and youth are in the backlog, where they've got their SIJ application approved, but they cannot get a green card and they're awaiting the green card? And the question, are you keeping a dependency open until the green card is issued? What are you doing in these cases?
Yeah, so I would say in South Carolina, because we also have a state law which basically prohibits us from expending any sort of public funds on an undocumented individual over the age of 18. Once they get their application approved, we have internally determined that child or youth to be here lawfully. And so they were giving them the option of remaining in care once they turn 18. That's our interpretation. And unless someone tells us differently, that's how we are dealing with it.
I'll say, yeah, this is definitely, this is a very big question. And I think, maybe could be a whole other panel at some point, discussing just this issue and how it's affecting child welfare agencies. So if the child welfare case and the immigration case will be separate, and if the child is going to reunify with a parent, we'll work with the immigration attorney to find a different form of dependency on the family court, so they could transfer from an abuse or neglect case to become a guardianship case or a direct placement case. So they don't need to stay in our foster care system for the special immigrant juvenile. They can be released if that's what's in their best interest. But if they are in foster care and they are not going to be reunified, one area that will happen is that if they are visa retrogressed and they can't apply for housing, NYCHA housing, because they don't have their green card yet, we can allow them to stay in care past 21 on a case-by-case basis. And we have several of those youth right now who are waiting for their green card to become current. We're hoping that it'll get sped up soon.
In New Mexico, there is extended foster care. At this time, the children who are in the backlog they're probably, hopefully, going to be out of the backlog before they turn 18. More importantly, that I see with our 16, 17-year-old, they want to start working. They don't have the work permit. So we've tried to have wraparound services for volunteer to increase their life skills, increase what kind of skills they have, so that when they get a work permit, they are able to be better prepared to go and start working. That's how we dealt with it in New Mexico.
Thanks very much, everybody. At this point, we need to bring the webinar to the close. I want to first thank all of our panelists and thank our colleagues at APHSA. We hope you've found the presentation and the discussions today helpful. The audio from the webinar will be available on the MPI event website tomorrow. If you're a reporter on the call and you want to follow up, you can contact Michelle Middlestad, MITTELSTADT at migrationpolicy.org. And as noted at the beginning, we do have our detailed report and then the infographic, which provides a sort of broad checklist-like approach to thinking about many of the issues, and encourage you to refer to those. So again, thanks very much, everybody, and very best wishes to all. Thanks.